FK torso and head rigs that we set up in the previous video work well and they're relatively easy to set up, but they do have some issues. One of the most significant issues is the need to counter key your rotation with the cog. Let's pretend this is a character's body and this is our center of gravity control here. If I want to have the torso curl like this, but not bend over like this, then this is what I have to do. First, I'm going to curl all of my individual pieces over like this. So now he's kind of bending over, looking down essentially. And then I have to counter rotate back with the cog in order to straighten the body up again. And it's very common to have to curl the torso this way or the opposite way. This way for crouches, the other way for big stretches and reaches. And generally it works just fine, but it isn't very intuitive or particularly natural to the way we actually move, and it can occasionally cause weird issues with your in-betweening. Now in 3D character rigging, it's more common to have individual control over the chest and the pelvis, individual position and rotation control, with sort of soft curvature and deformation in the belly area in between. They'll also include a center of gravity control to move both the chest and pelvis and head simultaneously. But having the ability to individually rotate and position the chest and pelvis allows you to curve the torso like we did here without any counter rotating. So your animation is going to be a lot cleaner and your posing is going to be a lot more intuitive. So in Duik version 15, the Bezier IK script was introduced, which now makes it much easier to actually create that same kind of 3D rig with individual pelvis and chest control with 2D characters in After Effects. So let's take a look at how this works in kind of an abstract way here before we take a look at it with one of our characters, because it gets a little obscure inside the full rig of the character, and I want to make sure you understand what's actually happening. Now, a quick word about terminology here. Throughout this course, you generally hear me talk about the top and bottom of an FK or an IK chain. Sometimes I use the term end, top, and end, and it's really probably not the best terminology, because saying top and bottom, often people think you're talking about the visual arrangement of your layers rather than the top and bottom of the parenting chain. And what I'm really talking about when I say the top of the chain is the topmost parent in the parenting hierarchy. And what I mean by the bottom or end of the chain is the bottommost child of the parenting hierarchy. Now, Nicholas Dufresne, who created Duik, his terminology actually works a little better because it avoids that top-bottom confusion. And he talks about root and end. So the root being the topmost parent in the parenting hierarchy, and the end being the bottommost child of the parenting hierarchy. So root and end are the terms he uses in his instructions. And just to make things really clear here, I went ahead and kind of labeled these both ways so we can kind of reconcile the terminology. And also because in this case, the top, quote-unquote, of our parenting chain is at the bottom of the screen. That's the way all of our torsos are. The parent of all of the children is going to be down at the pelvis, at the bottom visually. So let's go ahead and set up a Bezier IK chain here so we can see how this works. So let's start by parenting our FK chain together to get started. So once again, the bottom of our FK chain, or the end of the FK chain, is this null here. The top of the FK chain, or the root of the FK chain, is this null here. So we'll just parent these right up the chain. So now we've got our basic FK chain set up. Now we also have two controllers here. We have the end controller here at the bottom of the chain, and then the root controller here at the top of the chain. Now in a character rig, this would basically represent the chest and the pelvis. and this would be the spine in between, the belly. Now we're not going to actually have so many nulls in there, but this will make it really easy to see what's actually happening. So setting up the Bezier IK is very simple, but there is one part that's a little bit counterintuitive. Our last null in the chain here at the top, the one that shares an anchor point with this end controller, will not actually be selected when we select our layers to create our chain. So what we're going to do is actually start at the next layer up from the end of the chain. So in this case, that's layer 1. And then we select up the chain to the root. And then we select the two controllers, first the end controller, then the root controller. And we must select in that order. One layer up from the end of the chain, then however many layers in your chain up to the root layer, and then the end controller and the root controller. And it's important to note that a Bezier IK chain can have any number of layers. Then we go ahead and click Bezier IK, and you can see we have two options here, simple and cubic. Cubic allows us to create S-curves, but we just want a simple U-curve, so we want the simple, and we'll hit create. Now, something happened here that's a little bit confusing, because I did my job a little too perfectly here. I spaced these red nulls out perfectly equidistant from one another. And you'll notice that when I ran the Bezier IK script, a new controller was added. Now it just happens that that new controller perfectly shares the same anchor point with this middle null. But that is merely a coincidence because I happen to place my nulls equidistant. This null that was created by the script is simply placed in between the two controllers. It doesn't have any regard for the nulls in between. Okay, I just want to make that clear. This just happened to pop itself right there because everything is numerically equal. So let's color this green and size this up so we can see it from the other null. And now let's see what we've got. So if I click and drag on the top controller, notice how we get these nice soft curves on those nulls in the middle. And I can go either direction easily to create whatever curves I want. And I can also click and drag on the bottom and do the same thing. The null in the middle allows me to adjust that curve and create curvature without even moving the top and the bottom. So you can see that this is a very, very useful system, not just for torsos. A lot of other things that could benefit from this kind of simple, soft curvature. Long rabbit ears, for example, long props that need to flex or bend, or even rubbery limbs and fingers. But we're going to go ahead and integrate this into one of our torso rigs so we can get a more intuitive control over the body. So let's jump ahead to our hipster woman here. So you can see that we have our pins and our bone nulls already placed, and we're set up both for hip roll if we were doing an FK rig, and shoulder controls. Now you have to set up your pelvis area the same way you would for a hip roll for the Bezier IK rig, with puppet pins occupying the same positions as the anchor points of the upper legs, representing our hips, and then we have the pelvis null in the middle. Then of course we have the belly null and pin, chest null and pin, neck, tip of neck, and then the right and left shoulder, once again occupying the same exact position as the anchor points of the upper arms. Now we've also already starched this character. Also note that we've already snapped the anchor point for the torso to the pelvis null. Now usually you wouldn't do your starching until you got all your rigging done, but we went ahead and got this character starched up so we can focus on setting up the Bezier IK rig. And you can see we've just got very simple starch here, just some down in the pelvis, and then just a little bit in the chest to keep the chest solid. We also have created some controllers here as well. So we have our usual head controller and center of gravity control, but we've also added this chest controller that occupies the same position as the chest null, and a pelvis controller that occupies the same position as the pelvis null. One thing about this rig system is you are going to have more nulls on your character, so it's just one of the trade-offs with this kind of rig system. So let's go ahead and parent this up. The head and the neck tip, we're going to parent to the head controller as we usually do. And the head controller, in order to create our parent loop, will parent back to the neck. Now right away this is going to be a little bit different here. The neck null, rather than being parented to the chest null, will actually be parented to the chest controller. Also, the left and right shoulder nulls will also be parented to the chest controller. Then we'll parent the chest to the belly to the pelvis. The pelvis we will not parent at all. We're going to leave that unparented. Now the hip nulls are also going to get parented a little differently here. Instead of going to the pelvis null, the hip nulls will go to the pelvis controller. And then the torso artwork, just like for the hip roll, we're going to parent to the center of gravity. And let's just go ahead and finish all of our parenting here. So let's parent the left upper leg to the left hip, the right upper leg to the right hip, the left upper arm to the left shoulder, and the right upper arm to the right shoulder. All right, now we're ready to create our Bezier IK. Now here's the thing to understand here. This is a very, very short chain. We're only creating our Bezier IK chain between the chest, belly, and pelvis. So remember that we're not going to select the very end of our chain, which is the chest. We're going to select the next null up, which is the belly. So we're only selecting the belly, the pelvis, and then we'll select the chest controller and the pelvis controller. And we have to do it in that order, always from the end of the chain to the root of the chain, both on the nulls and on the controllers. Now let's hit Bezier IK, simple. And let's take a minute to take a look at this null that was created here. Let's turn it green so we can see it better. And just to note that it did not appear where the belly is, it appeared equidistant in between the pelvis and the chest. Now oftentimes when you're rigging, in many situations, it can be dangerous to change the anchor point value or even the name or the size of a null controller. But in this particular case, we can name, reposition, and resize this middle null here. And we want to size it and position it so it sits nicely and cleanly in our system here. Now note again that I'm only using the anchor point value to reposition these nulls so that their anchor points stay in exactly the same position. So again, the position value doesn't change. All right, now we want to take the chest, midsection, and pelvis nulls and parent those all to the center of gravity control. And then let's right away zero out all these controllers. Now we've got the ability to move and rotate the head, the chest, the belly, and the pelvis through these controllers, but we don't have a way to rotate the neck yet. So let's select the chest controller, add an angle control, lock the effect control window, open the rotation value of the neck null, Option-click on the stopwatch and tie it to that angle control. Okay, let's look at what we have here. We have, of course, our head controller to rotate and also position the head. Then we have our independent chest control here, which again not only rotates but also positions. And we have our neck rotation control on that chest null, so we can rotate the neck as well. The midsection control allows us to curve that middle section, and that's more useful for sort of shaping your torso when you're rotating the chest and belly. And then, of course, we have the independent pelvis control, which not only rotates again, but can also move position independently of the chest and the head. And, of course, our center of gravity control works just like we would expect it to. So it's a really nice intuitive rigging system. Again, you pay the price of having quite a few more nulls over your character, but it's really a much more natural way to work, and there's no counter rotation with the cog that you have to worry about. Now the last thing we need to do here is add some shoulder controls. So let's take the right hand here. Whoops, let's jump back. Hate when that happens. So let's take the right hand here and we'll add a point controller. We'll zero out the values, lock the effects control window, and then we're going to go down to the right shoulder null, and first we're going to zero it out. So its position value is also 0, and then we'll simply option click and tie that to the point control. Now we can raise and lower this shoulder and move it side to side as well. Let's go ahead and do the other shoulder control quickly. Okay, let's turn off the visibility of our nulls, lock our layers, shy them away, and then lock the properties we don't need on all these controllers. Remember that the midsection controller has no rotation value. All right, let's move on and take a look at this same Bezier IK rig in the context of a Unipod character, our old friend the Orange Woman. Okay, you can see our Orange Woman is mostly set up for us here as well. We've got all of our controllers, the chest, the pelvis, head, and the cog. We've already got our pins and our nulls in place. You'll notice that they're set up just like they were for the FK rig, except down here in the pelvis, where we have the pins and nulls for each hip, and then the separate pelvis null. Also note that our torso artwork layer, the anchor point has been snapped to the pelvis null. So we're all set to parent this up. And again, it's going to be just a little different because A, it's a Unipod character, B, we don't have any shoulders on the torso. So head tip to head, the head to the head controller. The head controller now is going to be parented to the chest controller. Then we're going to parent the chest to the belly to the pelvis, the hips to the pelvis controller. Then we want to parent the torso artwork to the center of gravity. And let's not forget our bun here. The bun we need to parent to the head tip. And let's go ahead and parent in our limbs. The right upper leg will be parented to the right hip. The right upper arm we're going to parent to the head null, because remember, we want those arms to move when the head moves. Then the left upper leg to the left hip, and then the left upper arm again to the head null. Now we're ready to create our IK chain. So remember, we want to select always from the end of the chain to the root of the chain. But in the case of the Bezier IK, we want to not select the very end of the chain. We want to select the next null up, which is the belly, then the root, which is the pelvis, then the chest controller, which is the end controller, and then the pelvis, which is the root controller. And we'll hit Bezier IK, simple. And now let's recolor, rename, resize, and reposition that midsection null. And then let's parent the chest, mid-controller, and pelvis all to the cog, and then zero out all the controllers. Now we don't need a neck rotation here because there's no neck. We're not going to bother with shoulder controls, but we could add them just to the upper arms and just slide the upper arms around if we wanted to. And let's go ahead and clean this up before we test it out. And let's remember when we're zeroing out our properties that the midsection property has no rotation value. All right. Now we can click and drag on the head and move the head around. But we've got that independent control over the chest. Look how nice that works. And the pelvis. All right, both with rotation and position. So a terrific way to rig up the torso. All right, now the last thing I want to show you is a fully finished rig here, but I just want to talk about how it's set up. It's our superhero woman here, and we've got a Bezier IK rig set up for her. But the significant thing I want you to note is how we've dealt with the torso and the leg. If you remember the previous lesson where we worked with this woman, both of the legs were separate from the torso. And we had to do a little noodling around to get that joint to work fairly well. And it worked okay, but it definitely had kind of a cutout sort of look. And I just wanted to show you that this option was available. On this rig, the torso and the leg, all the way down, is all one piece of artwork. And you can see that instead of a joint here, we just have bending and deformation in the puppet tool. And there's some advantages and disadvantages here. For the one thing, it's really nice on the artwork. It preserves the look and the texture of the artwork without breaking it. But on the other hand, the deformation is fairly tricky. The starch was difficult. And some things like this little line in back here don't look the greatest when you push it really, really far. But it's not bad. And again, all of these rigging techniques are a question of pros and cons, gives and takes. So we've gained some things here, we've lost some things. And vice versa if we jointed this leg. Let's take a quick look at how this is set up so you can see it. Here is the torso layer, and I'll just solo that, and you can see everything's been pre-composed into one piece. And if you can see how our pins are arranged, they're set up just like we would set up a normal torso rig, except this pin here, this hip pin, is also the right upper leg pin. So that pin is kind of shared by both rigs. And then the leg rig are these green nulls here, and it's set up just like we set up the other IK rig. And there's really no difference here. That's the beauty of the bone nulls, is that you can have them all driving a single piece of artwork, but they can behave as separate pieces linked together however you want. So really nice rig here with the Bezier IK system. A lot of possibilities for posing this. And we're getting a really nice joint here with this leg. Okay, we've looked at a lot of different torso rigs here, although you can see that there's a lot of patterns that remain consistent. But torsos are definitely going to be unique to each character, and you're going to want to customize based on the situation you're dealing with. Now move on to the exercise video and take a look at the torsos we have set up for you to rig.